the Burke theory. In this episode, we're going to take a look at Burke was responsible for the death of his younger sister, and his mother Patsy and father John covered up this crime. This video is divided into 3 parts. The first part, Burke had a deep feeling of resentment towards his mother. The second part, the physical evidence and details of the crime. And then the last part, the most likely scenario of the crime. When Burke was born in 1987, Patsy gave a great deal of attention to Burke because he was the firstborn and she was so happy. And then in August of 1990, when Patsy had JonBenet, she shifted most of her attention over towards JonBenet. And then a year later, they moved to Boulder in 1991. And Burke received a big drop in attention from his mother. And it wasn't like he received a lot of attention from his father. If anything, John favored JonBenet even more. Now looking at each of their bedrooms, JonBenet's bedroom had its own personal balcony where you could go out the door there onto the balcony, and it had its own personal bathroom. And it was in the new section of the house, and it was closer to where John and Patsy slept upstairs. And then Burke's room was in the older section of the house, and it had a window out to a shared balcony, and it didn't have a bathroom other than the one in the playroom or off of the playroom. Now each child had 2 beds in their bedroom, so when they had a guest over. But looking at this side-by-side view of the bedrooms, you can see that JonBenet's bedroom is much nicer than Burke's room. Now here's a strangely lit photograph of Burke's bedroom with the 2 beds, and you can see it's in the older part of the house by looking at the windows there. And then here's a photograph from within JonBenet's bedroom with her photograph, and there's no nice photograph of Burke in his bedroom. And here's a photograph of the playroom with all of JonBenet's trophies that she won. And here's a recording of their telephone answering machine that Patsy and JonBenet did for their summer house.
We're having a great summer. Wish you were here.
We are outside having a fun time playing. Please call us back. Leave your name and number.
Now here's your physical evidence that Burke did something, because Burke's fingerprint is on that bowl with the pineapple inside, and so is Patsy's, and his fingerprints are all over that glass with the tea bag inside. And Patsy and John testified that they went to bed and didn't get out of bed, and no intruder came in through the basement window and served Burke and JonBenet pineapple that night. That's crazy talk. People argue about the ransom note and an intruder spending 20 minutes to write the ransom note in John and Patsy's house while they were sleeping. And that's pretty wild. But an intruder serving them pineapple with milk is crazy talk. Now, the victim advocates didn't put that out on the table because, according to everybody, Burke was in his room that morning the whole time. Now, one point about this crime scene photograph is it appears to me that a child, Burke, got these items out because that spoon in the bowl is a serving spoon. It's a big spoon. And the glass has a tea bag in it, which is odd for making tea. And it's towards the edge of the table, not by a chair, so somebody was standing there drinking that tea. Now, the next item of physical evidence is the ransom note. And along the edge, either the left-hand side or along the top, it had a kind of a rough edge because it was torn out of a notepad. Now, sometime during that morning, when the police were doing their investigation, they asked John Ramsey if he had a sample of his handwriting and Patsy's handwriting. And John picked up 2 notepads, according to him, from this table here, or somewhere near it, and gave it to one of the police officers, who then had it transferred down to the police station. And later they found 7 latent fingerprints on the notepad. One from the police sergeant who handled the notepad, one from the crime scene investigator at the lab, and 5 from Patsy Ramsey. Now, this is an official entry form that Patsy filled out for JonBenet. And if you look at the unique little A's written in the word Ramsey and throughout the ransom note, they're unique. And then if you look at the S in Ramsey and the S in Ramsey in the ransom note, you can see how similar those little S's are. And there's other characteristics that are the same between Patsy's writing and the ransom note. For example, the large spacing between the words and the big indentation before each paragraph, and the exclamation marks often used, and even phrases where it says, if you want her to see 1997. Well, Patsy wrote a Christmas letter in 95 and 96 using similar language, and look forward to seeing you in 1997. And let's not forget the closing of the ransom note, where it seems like she's talking to John directly. Don't try to grow a brain, John. Don't underestimate us, John. It is up to you now, John. Sounds like she wrote that ransom note by herself, and she knew John was going to be reading it in the morning, and she needed to convince John to go along with the plan to cover for Burke. And then it closes victory, SBTC, and she told the police operator that she didn't read the entire ransom note, but yet on the ransom phone call, she said SBTC. And even if she had read the whole ransom note, would she have remembered those letters, SBTC, at that moment? Doesn't seem likely to me. And what about the ridiculous story she told the police, that she was wearing the same clothes as the night before, that she had done her hair and makeup that morning, that she read the ransom note without picking it up, that she didn't wake and speak to Burke about JonBenet being missing. And then John's, that he spread out the ransom note across the floor so he could read it faster, so he could kneel down on the floor and read the ransom note. And then how both of them didn't search and look for JonBenet in the morning before the police showed up, or before they called. Now let's move to the basement window. First, that window wasn't open like that. The police opened that for the photograph and the videotape recording. John said in his own words that it was slightly open, like 1/8 of an inch, and he pushed it closed and latched it sometime that morning. So it wasn't open. So that would mean that the intruder had to close the window behind him and replace the grating nice and neatly over the window well when he left. Now on the morning of December 26, John said that he went to the basement to look for his daughter, and he found the broken basement window and the suitcase beneath it. But in his book, he said that sometime that morning, I remember a day back in the summer when I broke the window. And then he reminded himself he needed to go downstairs to the basement to see about that broken window. Not to look for JonBenet, but to look at the broken window. That's a contradiction. Or maybe he went down to the basement to check on that broken window, so 3 years later he could write, maybe this is how the kidnapper got in and out of our house. And I want to point out that those that believe an intruder came in through that window, that you believe that because John Ramsey told you that. This story originated from John Ramsey. Lou Smith listened to John Ramsey. Other people listened to John Ramsey. John Ramsey, 6 months earlier, broke that window and entered the house. And his kidnapper entered the house that same way. But one thing that was different, it was 28 degrees out, and it was dark, and the person had never gone through that entryway before. And so I guess they took a chance. There would be no spiders or snakes or anything dangerous when they entered the basement. Patsy didn't put JonBenet to bed that night after they returned from Fleet White's house. The last time JonBenet slept in her bed was Christmas Eve. Now what you're looking at is a crime scene photograph of JonBenet's bed on the left and a photograph of JonBenet on Christmas morning. And on her bed you can see her blouse or her pajama top. And if you look at the sleeve on the clothes item on the bed and on the Christmas morning photo, you can see that that's the same article of clothing. And so another thing you'll notice is there's no pillow at the top where she would rest her head. So she didn't get in bed that night. What happened was, when they returned from the Whites, they got into their pajama clothes for bed, and then they played or did something on the first floor and were not supervised by Patsy or John. And then Burke got out the pineapple and the glass of tea. And then about an hour later, Burke severely injured JonBenet by either strangling her or by hitting her on the head with some metal object. And then later, Patsy found JonBenet unconscious. Patsy tried in vain to revive JonBenet, but there was no hope, and that's why she didn't call 911, and so she decided to cover up Burke's crime against his sister. Patsy wrote the ransom note alone, and then told John what had occurred, and he read her note. John then staged the crime as if it was an assault on his daughter. He made the garrote and strangled her to death. And Patsy wrapped JonBenet in the white blanket, placed her in the wine cellar, and put her favorite Barbie nightgown next to her. John placed the suitcase under the broken basement window. Then they decided how they would call 911. Patsy was to pretend to have found a ransom note. Patsy was going to call her friends Priscilla and Barbara over so they could see the ransom note and establish an alibi or a story that the police would believe. John told Burke to stay in bed, not to speak to anyone about what had occurred, and just repeat that he was sound asleep that morning. Later, John told Burke not to talk about the bowl of pineapple on the table and what to say about what happened that morning in the police interviews. In the morning, when the police had arrived at their house, Patsy and John were perplexed that the police acted if the kidnappers were going to call that morning between 8 and 10 a.m. Patsy wrote in the ransom note that the telephone call would be between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow. How could John get the money from the bank before 8 a.m.? How could John be well rested if the call wasn't for the next day? Patsy and John believed the police would leave and return the next day for the telephone call. Then they would dispose of JonBenet's body and get the ransom. So in conclusion, John had no choice but discover JonBenet's body in the basement because the police weren't going away. Also, he could have moved her body from a hiding place to the wine cellar around 11 o'clock when he went down to the basement alone. And the reason John handed over Patsy's notebook to the police because he wasn't aware that the pages to the ransom note came from Patsy's notepad. She had written the note when he was asleep. And the unknown male DNA came from one of two places. Either it was on the long johns and got on her underwear, or, you ready for this? It came from JonBenet's fingertips. She had touched somebody or some object and transferred the DNA to her underwear and to her long johns when she put them on that night. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved, and next week we'll have another episode with something even more interesting. Also, I wanted to tell you that they extracted the DNA from my sample, so hopefully we're going to get a result.